So imagine you've got this massive, sprawling, multi-billion-dollar corporation, right? And for years, it has just been bleeding money and completely alienating its customer.
Right, so the board is in an absolute panic. The stock is tanking.
Exactly. And the CEO suddenly decides to step down, but instead of bringing in, some visionary leader to turn the whole thing around, he just appoints his incredibly unqualified son to take over.
Oh, wow.
Right. And the PR department, they're pitching this to the world as this seamless transition of power. Like, it's this brilliant move for, quote unquote, continuity and stability.
But everyone inside the building knows the actual truth.
Exactly. They know it's a desperate panic move, and it's basically going to ignite this massive, incredibly destructive civil war right in the middle of the boardroom.
Because, when you bypass all the established rules just to force a hereditary succession in a system that's already fracturing, you aren't projecting strength. You are waving a massive red flag that the foundation is completely crumbling.
Exactly. Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you inside one of the most honestly volatile and complex geopolitical puzzles on the map right now, which is the internal power struggle tearing through Iran.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It really is. And to do this, we've got this fascinating stack of translated interviews with Iranian political analysts and members of the organized opposition.
Right, figures like Ladan Alijani, Mr. Sadri, and Hamid Azimi.
Yeah, exactly. So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack the appointment of a brand new supreme leader, the heavy hand of foreign powers dropping bombs, and this very specific, radically different path forward that's actually being proposed by the people on the ground.
And, just to set the parameters for you, the listener, right out of the gate here,
Yeah.
because we are dealing with highly charged political content involving the Iranian regime, opposition groups, foreign governments, we want to be crystal clear. We are not taking sides.
Right, no sides.
We are impartially reporting on the arguments and the viewpoints presented in the original source material. Our goal is strictly analytical, just to convey these ideas to help you understand the different perspectives at play. We're not here to be international judges.
Yeah, it's all about giving you the tools to see the entire board rather than just, the curated clips that make the evening news.
Absolutely.
So let's start with that corporate succession analogy, because that is essentially what is happening right now at the absolute highest levels of the Iranian government. The sources discuss this recent, frankly, monumental move by a group called the Assembly of Experts.
Right.
And they appointed Mojtaba Khamenei, who is the son of the previous leader, as the new supreme leader. And they didn't just, hand him the keys for a few years. They made it a lifetime hereditary position.
Which is wild. And to understand the gravity of this, we really have to look at what the Assembly of Experts actually is.
Yeah.
This isn't just some generic political think tank.
No, definitely not.
It's an ultra-conservative council of Islamic theologians. Their literal constitutional mandate is to vet and choose the supreme leader. So by rubber stamping Mojtaba, they have created this massive historical paradox.
Right, because you have to keep in mind the 1979 revolution that birthed the Islamic Republic in the first place was fundamentally, violently anti-monarchy.
Exactly. The entire ideological justification for the current regime existing at all was the eradication of hereditary rule.
But now, the analysts in our sources are arguing that by appointing the leader's son to a lifetime role, the regime has essentially just institutionalized a hereditary religious monarchy.
Yeah, they basically recreated the exact same crown they smashed in 1979, just with, different branding.
That is exactly it. But looking through these translated interviews, what really stands out to me is that Mojtaba doesn't even have the resume for the theological side of this job. The regime's own constitution dictates that the supreme leader must be a prominent, recognized religious figure.
Right, a revered scholar from the seminaries.
Yeah, but Mojtaba completely lacks that theological and ideological credibility. He just doesn't have it.
Which forces us to ask, well, if he doesn't have the theological weight to command a theocracy, what exactly is holding him up?
And the answer is terrifying.
Yeah, the analysts point out that his power base is almost entirely secular and martial. He relies almost exclusively on his deeply entrenched ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the broader state security apparatus.
So he's a creature of the intelligence wings and the military, not the mosque.
Precisely. The facade of an ideological, religiously guided republic is just completely gone at this point.
Yeah.
What we're actually looking at is naked military power holding up a completely uncredentialed heir.
Wow. Okay, so that corporate boardroom is going to get messy.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the core of their legitimacy crisis. Mr. Sadri, one of the analysts we're looking at, details how this forced hereditary transition is going to trigger profound internal fractures because the Iranian power structure is full of these competing fiefdoms.
Right, you've got traditional clerics feeling sidelined, economic factions fighting for monopolies.
The IRGC brass, the old leaders' inner circle. And for decades, the supreme leader acted as the ultimate theological referee between all these groups.
Oh, I see. So by forcing an unqualified son into that referee role, all those hidden, simmering rivalries are suddenly pushed into open conflict.
Exactly. Historically speaking, these are the exact types of structural fissures that precede the collapse of authoritarian states.
So they are desperately trying to project this image of total, unshakable control to the outside world while the floorboards are literally rotting out from underneath them.
Right.
But that brings up a glaring contradiction. If the regime is genuinely confident in this new era of, quote, continuity, why have they completely plunged the entire country into the dark?
Ah, the internet blackouts. This is where the geopolitical chess game hits the street level in a really brutal way.
Yeah, the sources describe a severe, suffocating internet blackout currently gripping Iran amidst all these foreign airstrikes. Hamid Azimi, one of the opposition figures, talks about the sheer psychological torture this inflicts on everyday people.
I can't even imagine.
Right. Families have absolutely zero communication with their loved ones. They are sitting in the dark, they're hearing bombs fall outside, and they have no idea if their children or their parents are alive, injured, or, buried in rubble.
And that is a calculated tactic of raw terror. Isolating an entire population during a military crisis makes them feel profoundly vulnerable.
But there's more to it than just terror, right?
Yes. The analysts argue there's a second, highly strategic purpose to cutting the cord entirely. The regime is trying to stop the hemorrhage of information regarding successful domestic resistance.
Right, because there are organized resistance units actually operating inside the country.
Exactly. They are actively disarming regime outposts, targeting IRGC commanders, organizing localized strikes, and if the internet is on, videos of those small victories go viral.
And that inspires copycats. It proves the regime can bleed.
Exactly.
But wait, here's where the history gets really fascinating. Because the regime hasn't always used a total blackout to fight protests. The sources point out that during the massive nationwide uprisings just a few months prior, the government actually kept the internet running during the initial waves.
Yeah, they did.
So why leave the communication lines open when millions of people are coordinating against you?
Because an open internet allows for psychological warfare. The analysts argue the regime kept the internet on specifically to artificially inject pro-monarchy slogans into the digital bloodstream.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Most notably the phrase Javed Shah, which translates to "Long live the king."
So they were purposefully amplifying a slogan that seemingly supported their enemies. I mean, that sounds completely counterintuitive.
It does, until you look at the mechanics of a mass movement. The grassroots uprising was unified around basic human rights and anti-dictatorship sentiment. So by artificially introducing a divisive, backward-looking slogan that glorified the previous dictator, the regime's cyber units successfully sowed confusion.
Oh, wow. They hijacked the narrative.
Exactly. They forced the opposition to argue with itself over the ghost of the Shah, rather than focusing entirely on the supreme leader. It was a deliberate operation to splinter the resistance.
That is incredibly manipulative. But it makes me wonder about their current strategy, actually.
How so?
Well, if they were confident enough to play those psychological games a few months ago, but now they've just pulled the plug entirely, does that mean the psychological trick stopped working? I mean, one of the analysts mentioned that the regime executed a record-breaking number of people over the last year to establish dominance, and the people just kept marching anyway. Yeah. So if a tidal wave of executions doesn't generate enough fear to stop a protest, physical disconnection is literally the last tool in the toolbox.
And that is exactly the synthesis these sources are arriving at. Authoritarian power relies on a very specific equation, right? Ideological loyalty plus the threat of violence.
Okay.
So when the ideology evaporates, you rely entirely on fear. But when a populace endures so much trauma that they collectively lose their fear of death or imprisonment, the state loses its psychological grip entirely.
Wow.
So shutting off the digital lights isn't a show of strength. It is a physical admission of ideological defeat. It's their final barricade.
But, when a government creates an information vacuum that massive, something is going to rush in to fill it. And historically, when there is a vacuum inside a country, voices from the outside immediately try to hijack the narrative.
Which brings us to a major focus of these translated interviews. There is this intense, often bitter critique of the Iranian diaspora, foreign military intervention, and specifically the figure of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah.
Yeah. There's a quote from the sources that just perfectly distills the opposition's perspective on this. One analyst referenced a popular sentiment that read, "King Reza Pahlavi was the excuse. King Mojtaba Khamenei was the sign."
Right. They're explicitly rejecting a return to the monarchy. They're rallying around the street slogan, neither Shah nor Sheikh.
It's a complete rejection of exchanging one absolute ruler for another. But the critique of Reza Pahlavi goes far beyond just a disagreement over the structure of government. The sources level incredibly severe allegations against him regarding his actions during the recent Massa revolution.
Yeah, this part of the reading was chilling.
It really was. The analysts claim that as the street protests were gaining momentum and becoming a genuine physical threat to the regime's control, Pahlavi utilized foreign-based Persian-language media networks to essentially pacify the crowds.
Right, he was broadcasting messages encouraging peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience.
Which, to an international observer, calls for peaceful protest always sound like the moral high ground, right?
Sure, yeah. But the analysts argue that on the ground in Iran, against this specific regime, it was a deadly miscalculation. Because you have to understand the mechanisms of the IRGC. They do not operate like a standard riot police force managing a crowd.
No, not at all.
The sources describe horrific systemic tactics. They talk about regime forces deliberately shooting peaceful protesters in the stomach just to incapacitate them.
God.
And then deploying operatives to hospitals to finish those protesters off with execution-style shots while they were seeking medical care.
So if you were telling people to go out and fight a heavily armed, utterly ruthless military apparatus with empty hands and peaceful chants, you aren't leading a revolution. As the sources accuse, you are basically turning a protest into a slaughterhouse.
Exactly. And that frustration with foreign-based leadership directly bleeds into their absolute fury over foreign military intervention.
Right.
There is this persistent narrative in Western media that foreign airstrikes will somehow destabilize the regime enough to liberate the Iranian people. But the analysts completely dismantle that illusion.
Yeah, they point to former U.S. President Donald Trump as a prime example of how foreign powers actually view this. The sources argue Trump completely ignores figures like Reza Pahlavi because he calculates that Pahlavi is far too weak to even serve as a reliable proxy for American interests.
And furthermore, Trump explicitly stated that the recent foreign airstrikes dropping bombs on Iran are strictly about protecting U.S. and Israeli geopolitical interests.
Right. They are not designed, planned, or intended to bring democracy to Tehran.
Yet, the sources note this surreal disconnect. They describe factions of the Iranian diaspora living comfortably in the West actually celebrating these airstrikes. There are mentions of people handing out whiskey in the streets of European and American cities to cheer the bombing of their homeland.
I mean, I can absolutely understand why the analysts on the ground are enraged by that. If foreign bombs are destroying your national infrastructure, airports, oil wells, hospitals, and killing innocent civilians in your neighborhood, that does not feel like liberation.
No, of course not.
It's like, imagine you're trapped inside a burning building, right? And you're desperately fighting the flames, and a fire truck finally pulls up. You think you're saved. But the firefighters step out, look at you, and announce they are only here to hose down the bank next door to protect the vault.
Oh, wow.
The bombs aren't a rescue mission. They are just adding more fire to your building.
That analogy perfectly captures the profound disconnect. Destroying a nation's resources only forces the surviving civilian population to become even more dependent on the regime's rationing and control just to stay alive.
Yeah.
You cannot bomb a country's infrastructure to dust and expect a thriving democracy to just sprout from the crater.
Okay, so if the current supreme leader is illegitimate and relying on a foreign-backed monarchy is a rejected, dangerous illusion, what is the actual mechanism for change? Like, what do these analysts and opposition members actually want to happen?
That brings us to the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or the NCRI. The sources outline their highly specific political blueprint. And what is really fascinating is how narrow their ask to the international community actually is.
Yeah, they are not asking for billion-dollar aid packages. They are not asking for shipments of weapons.
Right. What they want is official political recognition. They are asking the international community to formally recognize the Iranian people's legitimate right to armed struggle against the IRGC.
They want the world to stop treating this as a civil dispute and acknowledge that fighting back against this specific military monopoly is a legitimate act of self-defense.
Exactly. But the core of their strategy is a political blueprint for a provisional government that was actually drafted and agreed upon back in the 1980s.
Wow, so it's been around for a while.
Yeah, this isn't some reactionary plan they threw together last month. It is a foundational, legally binding document for their coalition.
And the defining feature of this provisional government is its expiration date. The mandate is incredibly strict. It's designed to exist for a maximum of 6 months after the regime falls. Its singular administrative job during that half year is just to organize a free, fair election for a constituent assembly.
And here's the mechanism that makes it totally unique. Hamid Azimi, one of the opposition sources who has dedicated like 30 years of his life to this movement, he emphasizes that after those 6 months, all members of the provisional government pledge to resign entirely.
Just walk away.
Yes. They hand all executive power over to the newly elected assembly, whose job will be to draft the new country's laws. And the sources specifically note that one of the foundational goals of this new assembly would be the complete and total abolition of the death penalty.
It is an incredibly detailed blueprint, yet it feels entirely absent from the mainstream global conversation. And the sources highlight this disconnect with a really powerful anecdote about a conversation with a Swedish journalist.
Yeah, Mr. Sadri recounts speaking to this journalist who, honestly, like many people in the West, believed the only viable opposition to the current regime was Reza Pahlavi. She had literally never heard of the NCRI's 6-month provisional government plan.
Right.
So Mr. Sadri walks her through the history to explain why Iranians are so deeply skeptical of foreign saviors. He brings up the 1953 coup.
Which is crucial context here because, for anyone unfamiliar, in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. And they did that specifically to consolidate the power of the Shah and control Iranian oil.
Exactly. When you understand that history, the slogan, neither Shah nor Sheikh, makes perfect sense. They've had their democracy stolen by foreign powers before.
Yeah.
But Mr. Sadri doesn't just give her a history lesson. He shares a profoundly personal story from his youth to explain the actual soul of the resistance. He talks about learning filmmaking in Iran with an 8mm camera, but his community was so deeply impoverished by the corruption around them that they couldn't even afford to buy the film.
That is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, he said they would just hold the camera, look through the viewfinder, and listen to the mechanical click and whir of the empty schools turning. Just imagining the art they could create if they only had the resources.
It takes this abstract geopolitical conflict and grounds it in this raw human longing for progress and creativity. They don't just want a new dictator. They want, as Mr. Sadri calls it, a European-style renaissance.
And for that Swedish journalist, hearing that deeply human ambition combined with a concrete democratic blueprint completely shattered her worldview. She admitted that her entire framework for understanding the Middle East had to be rebuilt from the ground up, just by actually listening to the people doing the work.
I love that story, I really do. But I have to play the devil's advocate for a moment on behalf of our listener.
Fair enough.
Because we all know how history usually plays out. Power is incredibly intoxicating. An armed group fights a brutal war for decades, overthrows a dictatorship, and takes control of the capital. The idea that they will simply organize some ballot boxes, hold power for exactly 6 months, and then quietly walk away into retirement, it sounds utopian.
It does sound utopian.
Right.
Yeah.
Is a self-destructing government actually realistic, or is it just a brilliantly crafted sales pitch for Western diplomats?
It is the most vital question to ask. But the sources address this skepticism by pointing to the mechanics of their coalition. They emphasize that this isn't just a campaign promise. It is a 40-year-old, legally binding contract within their organization.
Okay.
And Hamid Azimi challenges the skeptics directly. He points out that if the opposition leadership was solely driven by a thirst for wealth and power, they could have accepted the regime's numerous offers decades ago to sell out, compromise, and live comfortably.
That's a fair point.
Instead, they have spent their entire lives facing assassination and exile.
But practically speaking, how do you prevent a new authoritarian grip from just taking hold anyway?
Well, the analysts explain that the entire success of the 6-month transition hinges on one very specific prerequisite, which is the total dismantling of the IRGC.
Ah, Okay.
They contrast their plan with Reza Pahlavi's alleged transition strategy, which they claim involves instituting martial law in 20 major Iranian cities to maintain order. The NCRI argues that if you truly dismantle the oppressive military apparatus, if the IRGC is completely dissolved, the need for authoritarian control or martial law just vanishes.
Right. You don't need a dictator if you've entirely removed the dictator's army. If the threat of systemic violence is gone, the 6-month window can genuinely remain purely administrative.
Exactly.
So bringing all these threads together, what we are looking at is not the simple two-sided regime versus protesters narrative we usually see on television. It is a highly complex, really precarious triangle.
Yeah, it really is.
In one corner, you have a newly minted, panicking, hereditary religious dictatorship that has abandoned its founding ideology and relies purely on the military force of the IRGC. In the second corner, you have the ghosts of a foreign-backed monarchy waiting in the wings, hoping that foreign bombs will clear a path back to a throne.
Right. And in the third corner, you have a deeply organized domestic resistance that is demanding the right to armed self-determination, fighting for a temporary 6-month transition to a secular republic that abolishes the death penalty.
So, for you listening to this, the crucial takeaway is really about how we process global conflicts. When a crisis erupts and the internet goes dark, the loudest voices, which are usually the ones operating from safe foreign capitals with massive media apparatuses, they tend to take up all the oxygen in the room.
Absolutely.
But to truly understand where a country is heading, you have to look past the noise. You have to look at the people on the ground who are actually bleeding for the cause. And crucially, you have to examine the specific mechanical blueprints they harden for the day after the revolution succeeds.
And, thinking about that day after scenario brings us to a final, incredibly complex reality that I think we should all be pondering after this deep dive.
What's that?
We have talked a lot today about the IRGC being the ultimate barrier to freedom. We've talked about dismantling them to prevent martial law. But we have to understand that the IRGC is not just a group of guys with guns.
Right.
Over the last few decades, they have morphed into a massive economic monopoly. They own the telecommunications networks. They control the major shipping ports. They are deeply entangled in the banking sector and the national power grids.
So they're essentially the nervous system of the country's infrastructure.
Exactly. So the provocative question really becomes, if the entire economic and logistical survival of a nation is structurally intertwined with a corrupt military force, how exactly do you dismantle that force without completely collapsing the country itself?
Wow.
What happens the day after the regime falls, when the people holding the keys to the water treatment plants, the cellular towers, and the food supply chains are the very commanders who were just defeated?
It is an incredibly dangerous puzzle. It's like you manage to overthrow the corrupt CEO, but then you realize he hardwired the building's life support systems to his own pulse.
Exactly.
The true test of this revolution isn't just about forcing a collapse. It's about figuring out how to untangle that massive toxic web and build something beautiful without the entire structure caving in on itself.